inception, Canada has shown great pride in itself, touting a national slogan that this country was founded on peace, order, and good government. But beneath this national identity lies an unspoken and intentionally erased history, one of violence, displacement, and injustice. February 24th, 1884. A 14-year-old Stalo boy named Louie Sam was accused of a crime without evidence. Before he could defend himself in a court of law, a mob of American vigilantes crossed the border, abducted him, and lynched Louie on Canadian soil. It has been 141 years since this heinous act occurred, and in that time, the men who took Louie's life have never been brought to justice. This is not a story of a single isolated act of violence. It is a reflection of the deeply rooted color lines etched into our true historic narrative and the prejudice that shaped colonial Canada and influences the ongoing state-sanctioned violence that is enacted against Indigenous communities. As we begin to confront the legacies of racism and systemic oppression, we must ask ourselves, how do we reckon with a history that was designed to be forgotten? Situating Louie's story within a transnational context is vital to understanding how an American mob felt entitled to cross into Canada in 1884 and lynch Louie Sam. To truly honor Louie's story and the ongoing impact of his erasure, we must first understand lynching itself, how it became part of white America's identity, and how this inhumane act is woven into the very foundation of the United States. The practice of lynching is rooted in British legal and cultural traditions. British migrants brought with them collective violence as a form of justice, most notably the hue and cry method. If someone committed a crime, all able-bodied members of the community were obligated to pursue and apprehend the culprit. This method evolved in the early Americas, giving sheriffs the power to deputize men for similar pursuits. While these early practices didn't yet resemble the brutal lynchings we think of today, they laid the groundwork for what was to come. Between 1765 and 1780, revolutionary ideas ignited civil war between patriots and Tories. In Virginia, a practice called lynch law emerged, where criminals were given 39 lashes instead of a legal trial. This informal justice spread, setting the stage for lynchings to turn lethal. By the 1830s, groups like the Missouri Slickers took justice into their own hands by whipping their victims. However, in 1835, everything changed for the worst. In Vicksburg, Mississippi, 5 gamblers were hanged before a cheering crowd. Newspapers spread the term lynching nationwide, turning it into a recognizable term and a widespread practice. Over the course of 228 years, lynching became embedded in America's collective consciousness, romanticized by white supremacists as a necessary tool of social control. By 1884, when Louie Sam was lynched, these extra-legal murders were commonplace. The mob that came for Louie carried with them centuries of entitlement, and the belief that racialized violence was not only acceptable, but that lynching was the preferred method of resolving these conflicts. When we think of lynching in America, the focus is often on the Black victims. However, this obscures the lynching of Indigenous and Hispanic people. As white settlers moved west in the mid-19th century, their violence followed. In California and Texas, lynching became a tool for erasing Indigenous presence and establishing white dominance. Before the year 1882, An estimated 297 of California's 352 known lynching victims had already been killed. Many were indigenous. State-sponsored massacres in California and other western areas of the U.S. reinforced the growing culture of white supremacy and solidified the color line. The act of lynching became a small-scale reenactment of the colonial state's collective effort to eliminate indigenous people. In 1858, thousands of hopeful miners from California flooded into the Fraser Canyon, home to one of Canada's largest indigenous populations. These miners were equipped with more than just gold pans. They also carried their racial prejudices and inclination towards vigilante justice. Due process was well entrenched in both the U.S. and Canada by 1884. However, the act of lynching continued to gain popularity. In Washington state, every recorded lynching between 1848 and 1886 targeted an indigenous victim. While no Canadian directly participated in Louie Sam's lynching, white American settlers in the region felt emboldened and entitled to take Louie's life, knowing that when they crossed the border, their crime would be dismissed by the settler population in both the U.S. and the Dominion of Canada. As racial tensions escalated in the United States, a different but equally volatile struggle was unfolding in British Columbia between the growing settler population and the Stalo people. By the 1860s, land disputes were at the center of these tensions, and the Stalo feared they would suffer the same fate as other nations in Washington state, uprooted from their ancestral lands and forced onto distant reserves. In 1874, frustrations boiled over. The Stalo and neighboring indigenous nations petitioned government officials, demanding fair treatment. They insisted that each nuclear family needed 80 acres of land, and expressed direct concern regarding the ongoing acts of genocide committed by the settler population. A year later, Stalo leaders stood in protest, refusing to participate in the Queen's birthday celebration, declaring that she had not been a good mother and queen. In 1879, the Stalo began petitioning the Canadian government to grant their communities unification and self-governance. In response, a group of settlers sent a letter to the provincial government expressing their concerns. This letter was co-signed by the Superintendent of Indian Affairs and claimed the safety and security of settlers hinged on the disenfranchisement of indigenous peoples. While the Stalo petitioned to rightfully reclaim their stolen autonomy, settlers framed Stalo autonomy as hazardous and a threat to settler communities. They feared that a self-governing indigenous nation would destabilize their fragile colonial society. The racially charged moral panic expressed by the settlers in the Fraser Valley demonstrates their deeply rooted fear of indigenous resistance. This same fear would be harnessed by American vigilantes who crossed the border in 1884 and lynched Louie Sam without fear of consequence or retribution. Due to the transnational nature of Louie Sam's death, his lynching is one of the most well-documented racial murders of the 19th century. And yet, many Canadians have never heard Louie's name. In our present day, the only physical evidence that remains of his brutal death are these handcuffs. On February 24, 1884, in Nooksack, Washington, smoke rose from the home of James Bell, a local shopkeeper. Neighbors rushed to aid Bell with the fire, only to find that Bell had been shot as they watched his home burn around him. Rumors about Bell's untimely death spread quickly. A man had been seen arguing with Bell that day. Footprints were discovered leading to a nearby swamp. And then a teenager named Peter Harkness came forward with eyewitness testimony. He claimed he saw an outsider near the town, a young Canadian Indian on the Whatcom Trail. That boy was Louie Sam. Moral panic and racially charged fear overtook the settlers of Nooksack. There was no official investigation, no trial. The townspeople had taken on the role of judge and jury, and they were eager to serve as Louie's executioners. That same day, the Whatcom County Sheriff crossed the border into British Columbia and had Louie arrested. Louie was held at a farmhouse in the valley, and in the morning, Louie was to be escorted to New Westminster, where he would stand trial. Meanwhile, that same evening, 100 men gathered for James Bell's funeral. They called themselves the Nooksack Vigilance Committee, and they decided to take matters into their own hands. Borrowing clothes from their wives, the men crossed into Canada wearing their finest drag. Some scholars have proposed that their disguises, dresses, veils, red bands across their eyes, were a mockery of Stalo spirit dancers. Others have suggested this was an attempt to evade recognition. Upon encountering the mob from Nooksack, the Whatcom County Sheriff did nothing to stop them. Instead, he told the mob precisely where Louie was being held. That night, the mob forced their way into the farmhouse, kidnapped Louie from the settler Canadian authorities, and dragged him towards the border. Within 500 feet of the 49th parallel, Louie was lynched. The decision to kill Louie on Canadian soil was deliberate, a statement that American vigilantes could commit murder with impunity, and a declaration that white supremacy does not stop at the US-Canada border. By morning, outrage spread across the Stalo Nation. A delegation of 200 leaders gathered in Chilliwack. They demanded justice, and talks of a cross-border raid on the Nooksack settlement emerged. The Stalo concluded that Louie Sam was innocent, and they were prepared to cross the border to avenge Louie. Spurred by the political implications of a cross-border war between the Canadian Indigenous population and American settlers, Canadian officials assured the Stalo that they would be looking into the matter and demanding action be taken to achieve justice. Canada sent 2 detectives to Washington. They confirmed the Stalo's theory. A white settler from Nooksack named William Osterman was the murderer, the same man who first pointed the finger at Louie Sam. The Canadian detectives believed Osterman orchestrated the crime, sending Louie away at the last moment so that he would be framed. However, no action was ever taken. No arrests were made. The Canadian government feared conflict with the US, and white settlers in British Columbia had no interest in defending an Indigenous boy. To make matters worse, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald found Louie's murder humorous. He compared Louie's death to American complaints his office had received about the loss of livestock. American authorities also made no effort to identify the vigilantes. It is well nigh impossible, wrote the governor of Washington Territory, to investigate a crime the entire community wishes to keep a secret. The Stalo continued to demand justice, but their call went unanswered. Over time, the case of Louie Sam faded into the background as more recent and pressing concerns arose for the Stalo Nation. Louie's life was stolen, and justice was never served. The lynching of Louie Sam was not just an isolated act of orchestrated violence. It is a reflection of how settlers have constructed a society built on fear, prejudice, and acts of white supremacy. In the United States, racial violence was often blatant and bloody, but in Canada, it was subversive and systemic, hidden behind the illusion of peace, order, and good government. Today, as we grapple with conversations of racial inequity, justice, and reconciliation, we must remember Louie Sam. We must speak his name and ensure his story does not continue to be swept under the rug. The lynching of Louie Sam is a stark reminder of the ongoing injustice that impacts Indigenous communities across North America. The story of Louie Sam directly challenges the national identity built by the Canadian settler state. And if we wish to build a just and equitable society, we must confront our uncomfortable truth. We must continue to speak the name, Louie Sam.